Welcome back. Now we'll continue with the next panel discussion. For those of you joining us now, welcome to Bulgaria's first podcast festival. We were very excited to have Latif Nasser talk to us about his latest mini-series called The Other Latif. And now I'm thrilled to welcome the next panelist as part of this festival. What a fascinating story it was, this of The Other Latif. And now we'll continue talking about how to tell captivating stories with three amazing speakers. We actually have Tracie Hunte, who is a colleague of Latif at Radiolab. Hello, Tracie. Thanks for joining us. We also have Gregory Warner, who is the host and creator of Rough Translation. Welcome, Gregory.
Thanks.
And we have Anna Blagova, who is one of the creators and a co-host of the Urban Detective, the first narrative podcast in Bulgaria. Hello, Anna.
Hi.
And of course, each of you can go online and read their bios. I don't think they need any introduction. That's why I want to briefly tell you about their work or about them through one story that I, as a listener, for example, stayed with me. Recently, it was in June, Rough Translation aired a story called Hotel Corona. And as the pandemic kept raging around us and around the world, it was this very heartwarming story about a hotel which brings together Jews and Arabs, religious and secular, and have them share meals, laughs, sometimes coughs, selfies, Zumba moves. They were all recovering COVID-19 patients, and while the hotel is no longer working, it helped forge unlike bonds and friendship. And really, when I listened to this story in May, it was the reprieve basically that I needed in the midst of this bizarre times. And when it comes to Tracie, Radiolab recently had an episode called Nina, where she explored the famous singer Nina Simone's civil rights legacy. And basically, she heard a song. It was a performance from 1968, following the murder of Martin Luther King and the protest. And it turned into a story about the then ongoing protests against systematic racism in the United States. And when it comes to Urban Detective, which explores a different topic related to urban life, one of my favorite episodes, it's called The Sea of Sofia, and it actually tells the story of how the Communist Party in Bulgaria back in the day had this grand architecture plan to build an artificial sea around the capital of Bulgaria, Sofia. So there you have it. If you haven't listened to those episodes, I highly recommend them. And now, just before starting with the questions, as we did with the previous session, towards the end of the discussion, we'll have time for audience questions. So feel free to ask away in the Q&A section of this webinar. For those of you who need translation, please click on the interpretation on your Zoom menu and click the Bulgarian channel. Well, I'm so excited to have you with us today. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. And obviously, a compelling story can keep us on edge for hours on end. And I want to start with Tracie. So Latif told us about the miniseries, but in general, what constitutes a good Radiolab story?
Yeah, so I think what constitutes a good Radiolab story is that we we kind of want the listener to uh, almost go on a journey with the characters, where you are starting out in one place, and then by somewhere in the middle of the story, you kind of change your mind about the situation, and then by the end, you change your mind again. And then when it's all done, you're not really sure how to feel about about the story you just heard. And so I think like a really good example of that is I think a really classic example of that is our reporter Simon Adler did a piece a few years ago about rhino hunting, that, you know, an American's going over to Namibia to hunt rare Black rhinos. And then you kind of, by the end of it, you learn about how, you know, the rhino, by doing this, they're able to raise, the government of Namibia is able to like kind of raise enough money to help preserve these Black rhinos, but it's done through hunting. And so you're just like morally conflicted about how you feel about this situation. And so I think that's kind of like the classic Radiolab story. You know, I think one of the biggest stories I did for Radiolab was with Latif, actually, was a border trilogy, where we investigated what happens, you know, how is it that so many migrants die trying to get into the US? And the fact that that number had exploded sometime in the 1990s, whereas it used to just be like, you know, maybe a dozen people died in the desert, to now we have up to 100, up to 1,000 sometimes dying in the desert trying to get into the US. And so what happened? What about the US policy that changed? And kind of like trying to go back into that history and peel back all these layers to figure out how we got here. And so I think like, you know, Radiolab over the years, we become more of a how did we get here kind of podcast. Especially now in the US when there's so much, you know, stuff going on in the US. We've been spending a lot more time trying to figure out like, what is it about our history that can tell us about how we got here and how we can potentially fix it. So I think that's where we are right now.
Thank you. I do remember the border trilogy story, and I'll come back to it a little bit later in the discussion. So Gregory, I mean, rough translation brings stories from faraway places to the United States. What's the thing that you're looking for in a story?
Well, and first, thanks for inviting me here. It's great to come after Tracie, because I feel like so much of what I learned about podcasting really came from working on Radiolab stories. So that idea of taking a journey with a character is definitely the same kind of language we use over at Rough Translation. I would say that one thing that we're often looking for is how does this, is a story of somebody kind of coming up against the rules of a place or the cultural rules of a place, and either learning something about those rules or about themselves. And we, through that, often kind of have a perspective shift or a change of assumptions, because sometimes the rules of a place make us think differently about the rules that are sort of invisible to us. You know, an example of that, I suppose, just more recently, we just did a series called School of Scandal, which we called School of Scandal, which were 3 episodes that that were around the world. One was about caste discrimination in the US. So an Indian social order, or South Asian social order, I should say, that was then imported to Silicon Valley and was kind of coming under the radar of a lot of the ways we talk about discrimination or bias in the US, because it's like an invisible code if you're not of that culture. And in fact, even for some 2nd and 3rd generation Indians in the US, it's invisible to them. And yet it was having such a huge effect on who was hired and who's not. And another kind of example is from that same series, Stella Nyanzi, who's a Ugandan activist, saying all kinds of extremely scandalous and spectacularly vulgar things about the president, who's a strongman president. It sort of makes you think, well, wait, why in an incredibly conservative African country, very Christian country, would this person be the kind of popular hero? And it looks at sort of what rules she's taking advantage of, which are pre-Christian traditions. And so, yeah, so sometimes people activating those traditions to help them, other times bumping up against them and having quite a few obstacles as a result.
Thank you. And Anna, narrative podcasting is relatively little known genre in Bulgaria. What made you decide to start a narrative podcast?
Well, first, I also want to thank you for the invitation and for giving me the chance, and my co-hosts, who are not here right now, to be on a virtual stage with some of our most favorite podcasts. And the answer to your question is that we were really not very concerned with the fact that they weren't popular, or maybe actually we were, but we were just huge fans of Radiolab. And we were like, wouldn't it be great if there was something like that in Bulgarian? And then we just had to try and do something. This was the reason.
And do you think there is interest for such genre in the country?
I think it's developing. It's definitely developing. It would be great if more of the public media and national media got into developing this genre, because I think it's a genre that needs a lot of backup and it needs a lot of funding to be developed. But to be completely honest, when we started, which was 2 years ago, there weren't so many Bulgarian podcasts in any genre at all. So I just think that this revolution that everyone is talking about maybe is about to come here a bit late.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, that's why we're doing the podcast festival. We see some momentum happening, and we want to bring extra inspiration. And actually, yeah, it's so fascinating actually to connect the voices to the faces, because usually I'm headphones on and have enjoyed the narrative rather than imagining the person behind it. Each of you mentioned some of the episodes and some of the topics that you've already explored. So how do you find story ideas? I mean, those kind of story ideas that bring you to the journey that Tracie and Gregory already mentioned.
I'll go first because I feel like I have the shortest answer. I'm really bad at finding story ideas. I'm really bad at it. Especially because at Radiolab, like we really try hard to find, you know, that kind of character, you know, that story that's going to give you the character arc that we look for in our show. And as a matter of fact, the Border trilogy, like that was Latif's story idea that I just sort of attached myself to, and because we work really well together. And a couple of my other stories, you know, I found ideas on Twitter when I see people on Twitter talking about things I'm really interested in. I try to follow my own natural curiosity. I try to, a nice thing about working for a public media company is that you get sent lots of books, and so that can be really helpful. But yeah, I'm really bad at it, so I'm excited to hear how other people find other story ideas.
Okay, I didn't expect that answer. So just a quick follow-up on that. Would you say that brainstorming is like a collective process at Radiolab?
No, not really. Sometimes, you know, like, so with our insomnia line kind of episode was a little bit of a brainstorming idea. I had I for a long time, like I work in podcasting, but I love live radio. And for a long time, I've been like, wow, it would be so cool if Radiolab had like a live call-in show or something about that. And then the quarantine started. We'd all been having so much trouble sleeping. A couple of us have talked about, like, you know, how we call each other. So it just kind of like was one of those things that bubbled out to call, you know, and that's not like kind of like, it was one that definitely came from different parts of the team to like come together, where we all just like a couple of us decided to stay up all night, come, you know, make a Google Voice number and then just get people to call us and interview them on the radio. Not live though, but I would have liked it if it was a live show even more, I think. But that kind of aesthetic, that feel, and it turned out to be really, really great. But yeah, that's so. But a lot of our story ideas, you know, like maybe if I have an idea, I go to one of my, you know, colleagues and ask for help, or come up with people to talk, you know, come up with like a list of people to talk to, sources that we have. But for the most part, we our story ideas are kind of like individual. We come up with them by ourselves. Yeah, not really brainstorming.
Yeah, that was an awesome episode. So Gregory, do you have tips for us and maybe for Tracie, or how do you search for your story ideas?
I mean, yeah, just to mention on the insomnia episode, which was so good. It's also, what was so good about it was that the old model of a radio story doesn't then become the prison of the future. It doesn't lock you into a particular way of telling a story, but rather you use techniques of storytelling and try a new format. So that can often be a limitation I find in the team in terms of brainstorming, because we're maybe stuck on a particular way. But no, I would say I personally wrote myself into a box when I was pitching this show, because I remember in many times would say, listen, we're not going to do kinds of stories that, and this didn't mean to in a bad way, but we're not going to do the kinds of stories you would brainstorm in New York or Washington, D.C. Like, we're not going to think of something that we're curious about and then follow that. We're going to find out about something and realize we should be curious about it. So kind of reversing that. Unfortunately, that was pitched when I was overseas, and now I'm in New York. But the fortunate thing is that we have 17 NPR international correspondents, and we meet with them now on Zoom every 2 weeks to basically collectively brainstorm with them and what they're seeing on their beats. So that's amazingly helpful. And then in addition to that, people in different parts of the world who are pitching us stuff, there is some degree of kind of, okay, what if we could be curious about this and following that? But I mean, that's harder. It's harder for us because it, you know, you start with where you are, and then you have to somehow make this leap to someplace you didn't know to go.
Yeah, tell me about it. As a journalist myself who is pitching stories from, let's say, a little known country in Eastern Europe, sometimes it's hard to convince editors that this is worth reporting, etc. So do you bring, let's say, local reporters into the brainstorming session, or they pitch you separately and then you decide which stories to develop?
I mean, it's both, but I'm glad you mentioned that about what's worth reporting, because and it's always a kind of mental exercise that you're constantly schooling yourself on. But to me, I mean, people have pitched us stories that they said, oh, wow, I pitched other places, but they weren't interested because it wasn't important or didn't register. But then we do the story and people get really into the episode and it's popular. It's so I feel like, in some sense, what I like to be able to do and what I try to do is to understand what I should be curious about. Like, it's not what I am curious about now sitting in my chair, but if I only take this journey, I'm going to be completely curious about it. And kind of fun thing about working with freelancers and correspondents who are based in a place is not only that they have access to stories, but that they're sort of filtering it through a certain level of knowledge. So like, no, but this thing happening in Afghanistan, whatever is, no, but this is really interesting. And it doesn't fit with the Afghanistan conversation that say we're having, but so it's that extra work of figuring out why you should be curious, which often then is some radio trick, like using a character, using a kind of a journey of a story or the reporter's journey to get us to that place that then we can start looking around with that person.
Right. Yeah, you had an episode about a missing photojournalist in Iraq that stuck with me, and I still remember it very vividly. And it shows how important is the work of local reporters and to have people in the field. And I think we'll get back to it a bit later. So Anna, how did you choose to focus on architecture, cities around Bulgaria, and what were you thinking behind the episodes that you've produced so far?
So originally the idea of the show was to investigate or interrogate myths and urban legends, not in the sense of true crime or such urban legends, but things that people repeat and say. For example, you get into a taxi and the driver starts telling you how, there's a network of underground tunnels in Sofia which connect so and so such and such place, and that the deputies from the parliament can escape to the mountains. So the idea was to focus around such funny folklore that all of us have heard, and through it, of course, investigate it. But the idea was to try to tell a larger story about how the city developed, tell a lot of stories around it. Of course, there are a number of popular myths like this that you can investigate. So we've also, as we made the second and the third season, moved to history. And looking back at history, I find a lot of inspiration in archival photos and in archives. For example, a photo of the old airship over one of our famous churches was really interesting for me. And I was just as Latif said, how come I didn't know that? I'm 35 and I didn't know that. So this became an episode about Bulgarian avant-garde artists, which somehow got connected to this idea. So all kinds of ways stories come.
True. Okay, so let's assume you find the perfect pitch, you start reporting. How do you produce a story so you can seduce the audience to pay attention and to stick with it? I know it's a hard question. Maybe start with Gregory this time.
Well, I like that you use the word seduce. I mean, I don't know how common that is in journalism to think about the seduction process, but it does feel like if you're starting with a story that doesn't have necessarily like news importance, and it's not short, you're telling people to come on a ride with you. Yeah, I mean, it's like any act of entertainment. I mean, you want to get people involved. There's not like a general rule about it. I mean, I can think of any number of stories we've started, but like using, techniques from, This American Life or Radiolab or 99% Invisible. I mean, a lot of people, I think, use similar techniques and of either starting with character or starting with a question, which is quite important. I find that in working with reporters, they're often giving us a lot of interesting material, but then really drilling down and figuring out what the question they're trying to ask gives a kind of momentum, because if you can ask a compelling enough question, then people might stick around for the answer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Tracie.
Yeah, I think that question is so important important. And that's also like a part of it that I sometimes struggle with as a reporter, because I find that I'm just sort of, you know, the way I report is that I try to talk to everyone involved in the thing, whatever the thing is that happened. And then sometimes now trying to drill in like, okay, but what am I really trying to focus on can be a little difficult because I feel like I have so many voices in my head. But yes, I feel like figuring out that question is so important. You know, at Radiolab, we often try to figure out that question just like in the writing the pitch. You know, we ask a question to all our pitchers, whether they're internal or, you know, we're working with freelancers, like, what about this is interesting to you? What's your big question that you have? Because we definitely feel that the listener, if the reporter is excited and really into something, the listener will get there too as well. So it doesn't really matter if the thing isn't really that newsy, or if the thing is about this, like, you know, about square dancing or something, you know, like if we can just sort of make the, you know, if we can like hear the excitement in the journey of reporting it, that will bring, you know, the listener along. And then there's like other, you know, kind of just classic radio things of like, you know, really good writing and really good, you know, sound design, you know, that's really important. And that will also hook people. We try at Radiolab to make things really cinematic. And we kind of use a lot of like more movie documentary type things. I remember I followed this reporter on Twitter, and she kind of said something that I hadn't really thought about, where she was like, yeah, you know, in journalism and when you learn to write for a newspaper, you put all the important information up top, and then like the rest of the story gets like, you know, that classic inverted pyramid style. But like radio stories, they just start at the beginning. And it's like, yeah, like the important stuff that you want to get doesn't really happen to like 30, 40 minutes into the piece or something. And that's how we, you know, and so in that way, but we do that because like, we want to like bring you along, you know, the reason why somebody may read a story in a newspaper versus listening to it on the radio is because they want to like be brought along on a journey. And so we just kind of make that journey as fun as possible and as interesting. So yeah.
Well, following up on that, exactly. I mean, in J school or just like journalism 101, we were taught that, you know, each narrative has a structure, there should be a conflict that the protagonist is experiencing, and then we're introduced to a resolution. But what is the key to making those stories, as you say, to bring along the listener and make them really intellectually and emotionally engaging for the people, who listen?
I guess making sure that the story has those things to begin with, that it does have conflict and tension and so on. Oh boy, I don't know the answer. Gregory or Anna?
Yeah, I would just say that I'm like, those things are so hard. Like you say, like, well, yeah, we know about those things, but actually to get intention and conflict and resolution in real life is so hard, I think. So if you have that, like, you're really 87% there.
Yeah.
And yeah, also what Tracie said about like putting the important stuff, like start at the beginning. That is true. And it's so, I mean, it's so hard to do. Like even in the story that we were structuring this morning, and I was thinking about this, there's a reason that this person we're going to introduce you to is actually, she changed like war. I mean, she's so important, but like, should we reveal that right at the beginning or later? And I was kind of like wondering about that in the sense that it would maybe help engage you, but maybe it's the thing that you're going to want to hit in the first turn. So I mean, it's not an easy rule to follow. I don't find it an easy rule to follow by any means.
Yeah, I mean, another. I just thought of another word that we use a lot at Radiolab, and I'm forgetting here, and that is also maybe not helpful, but surprise is is another big part of that. And you know, and I mean, and I guess, Gregory, what you're talking about with, you know, you're trying to hold back a character you're thinking about, and maybe this person is supposed to be some sort of surprise, and so you're trying to figure out like where to put this surprise, you know, like that sort of stuff is like really, can be really, really tricky. And you know, I'm working on a story right now that kind of that covers a little bit of the AIDS. And so this is all stuff that happened 30 years ago. And this is also a story that, that I think people probably think that they're very familiar with. You know, and so the surprise element, the tension element, the conflicts, all those things are a little trickier because some, you know, because they're kind of recent history, or like, you know, very YouTubeable, you know, like if you want to see what you know, like this ACT UP was doing in the 80s, or in the 80s and 90s, you just have to Google it and you'll find a million videos about it. And so that's been really tricky, is trying to find out how to introduce like things like conflict and tension, that, you know, to a very old, well-told story, but in like in a new way that also revealed something unexpected. And so, and I mean, and I think I found that in my reporting, but now it's just a question of presenting it in a way that that listeners will respond to and will make them, you know, I'm really worried that they're going to start listening to it and be like, oh, I know this story already, and then not listen to it anymore. And so the beginning of our piece is now is way more important than I think in usual, because it's like, we really have to hook people. And, you know, and one way that we're thinking about doing it is like, so one of my characters, he, his lover died of AIDS, and he has this really beautiful love story about him. And so we think we're going to start with that love story and make it just really, really gorgeous, because whereas that's a familiar story to a lot of people, you know, young gay man in the 90s whose lover died at too young an age is sort of like a familiar story at this point. We think that the individual details of that story can be the thing that draws our listeners in. So that's how we're going to approach it. Who knows? Maybe we'll change it 8 more times before it comes out. But that's like that's like the thing we're trying right now. And so I guess like for this type of story, the details, the reporting it's going to be like really important. I mean, it's always important, but it's going to be what distinguishes it from other like stories like this. Yeah.
So once you find that surprise moment, you know that maybe you have it.
Yeah.
Gregory, do you have this kind of aha moment during a reporting or producing a story where you know that it's gonna be a good yarn, or until the very last moment you're still wondering? I mean, as you mentioned, just nailing down the structure, or like following this tried and true rules of you know, constructing a story.
Yeah, I mean, those aha moments are one of the reasons that I still wake up in the morning. It's like one of the greatest feelings is to be interviewing somebody and feeling like you're giving something new about that person, or helping see them in a way that they wouldn't have been seen. It's like yeah. But no, I think that one of the challenges, or one of the opportunities, or whatever you can say, is that the audience is fairly smart about all this stuff, you know, and I feel like there were techniques that we could have used a few years ago to set up surprise that don't. Maybe some of them still work. I mean, there are techniques that have been used in novels written hundreds of years ago that still work. So it's kind of art is art, but I do think that if you start. There's ways in which, you know, if you start a story in a certain way, people do know then the traditions of the narrative journalism and surprise, especially because yeah, the surprise is like the first thing that people learn to recognize, and it doesn't mean that it can't still be enjoyable, but I do find that just saving information for later, because you then reveal it, can actually backfire. You know, people are like, well, wait, if you had told me that, I mean, you know, and so, and you know, I've argued in that way with podcasts myself. So it's really hard to know in any one moment, sort of, you may have a aha moment, but that was like many, many months ago, and you no longer have the aha moment to guide you. And so you just have to figure out, you know, where it would go. But yeah, so it's not easy. I guess it's the sum of what I'm saying.
For sure. And what's the role of like finding the right protagonist or character in this regard? I mean, when, let's say, the surprise or the aha moment is gone, to like help you shape the narrative and the story you're telling.
So, I mean, just, yeah, I'll just make a short answer, but I think, of course, I mean, obviously it's extremely important, but I would say that one of the things we do try to do, because we're an international show, is not make characters have to have a kind of sense of transformation or a realization themselves. And I love those moments when they happen, but you know, that kind of comes out of reporting that I've done overseas, where people are not as, I mean, you know, I don't want to speak generally about the world, but I've reported in places where certainly people are not sort of speaking in a kind of self-aware American tradition, where you know not only what you feel about something, but why you feel that way, and why your parents maybe made you feel that way, and a kind of a psychoanalytic kind of sensibility. So people are like, yeah, they don't sometimes go further than that in the tape. And then I feel like it's our job to figure out why, and sort of try to understand enough about the place, or about the rules of the place, or other things around that may help us kind of understand it. So I think, yes, of course, character. I mean, we're taking, like Tracie said, we're taking a journey with a character. So that's always invariably like the easiest kind of structure to manage, is one character through. But yes, less important for us that the character have a huge transformation moment. They may have just lived their life, and we just now try to understand it.
Thank you. And Anna, you come from print background, and you know, the same rules that we just discussed apply to both print and audio stories. What was the most challenging part of creating audio stories?
I'm not sure that the same rules necessarily apply. And I think, as the other said, you can be, and you actually have to be more inventive and more creative with podcasts, because we learn a lot of techniques from listening to popular podcasts and from listening to Radiolab, and but they are becoming a bit maybe, as Gregory said, a bit overused. So actually, one of the reasons that we started the podcast was also, I found it a challenge to write for a medium that doesn't have any pictures, to experiment with some sort of script writing. So this is always a treat for me. And yes, I enjoy it when I have all those things that I want to put somewhere, and then I start one sort of thread of the way the thing is going to be, and then I realize, oh no, let's start with this one, and then I go back and forth. I actually enjoy that. It can get unnerving after a while, but it's definitely very exciting.
To put together the pieces of the narrative puzzle. I mean, with Urban Detective, you don't just stick to the present and issues relevant to, I don't know, current affairs. You also explore the past. But 30 years after the fall of communism, there's a whole generation that was brought up after the fall of the regime. So how do you tell those stories so they're relevant to this to this generation?
Well, I hope they are relevant. We've actually been going back not only to, let's say, communist times, but we've been going back to the pre-1944 period, so to the Third Bulgarian Kingdom, so to speak. And then lately, we've been going even back to Ottoman times and the 19th century when Sofia became a capital. So I don't know. To be honest, we are guided mostly by things that we find exciting. We are of this generation that was born in the middle of the 80s, so we have just very faint memories from how people from life before 1989. And to be honest, I find this thing fascinating, that your life can just change drastically over time, that over one night, that the life of my parents and my grandparents was just changed in a very brief amount of time, and they didn't expect it, and most of them didn't expect it. And I find this extremely interesting, and I want to explore this, and I still don't know how to actually capture. I mean, can we relive this emotion that they lived, or what do we remember from it? I think it's been kind of imprinted on us growing up in this time. So this is a reservoir of excitement for me, but I don't know I hope we manage to translate some of it.
Yeah, for our foreign attendees, the first season of the podcast is actually also in English, so you can have a listen. And actually, what you just said about using the journalistic tools for writing and then applying them maybe to audio stories, or not quite, I just wanted to ask you, do you think there is a difference between a compelling story in general and a compelling audio story? Maybe Anna, you can go first this time, and then.
I think in theory, you probably can make any story, if it's a compelling story, it can be made, I think, into a compelling audio story, or in theory, if you are if you're talented, I guess. Not sure that I can make it, but I think in theory it is. And of course, there are some stories that are better suited for audio. I think maybe the others can share some insight into.
Well, I was just going to jump in and say that yes, in theory, any story that is compelling on paper can be compelling on audio, or but I think the toughest part, but I mean, I think that the practical considerations we always think about at Radiolab is, who's going to tell this story? Are people alive? If this is a thing that happened 100 years ago, is there like some historian or journalist or writer who's a good storyteller and sounds really good on tape and can talk us and walk us through this story? Is there any archival audio that we can use to help illustrate this story? We did an episode about the 1918 flu pandemic, and we used voice actors and we used historians. We used, all sorts of people to try to take us back to that time. So yeah, it can happen, but I mean, I think there are like a lot of practical concerns as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Gregory.
Yeah, I mean, I just got to catch the end of his chat, and he was saying something smart as always about how radio basically, or podcast, exists in your head. You're walking down the street, and then you mentioned that about walking down the street. And so I think the way we receive the story is also so important in terms of the kind of story you can tell. It's, oftentimes it does take place in this space in your head, and we can get in the heads of somebody because we just hear their voice in a way which makes some things just loom larger and other things become less less resonant. So in theory, of course, you can tell any story, but we find that when we're taking our radio stories into print, because we also put them oftentimes a version on npr.org, we are just telling it totally differently. The intimacy that we could have just started with needs to be achieved and arrived at, and I feel like is never quite as intimate as it was on the radio.
Yeah, I very much agree. From the listening side. Now I want to ask some of the questions that we received. I mean, earlier we talked about what stories are worth pursuing. Now Mike Atkins wants to know, how do you decide that a subject is not worth reporting or telling us about? To flip
Not
it.
I don't know if the right terminology is not worth reporting. I think sometimes some stories just aren't for you because they don't fit your podcast aesthetic or your point of view or the kinds of stories you're interested in. We had situations where people pitch stories to us and they would not work for us, but then they ended up on other podcasts and they were great on those other podcasts. I don't know if that's the right way to say it, because I kind of feel in theory that all stories are worth reporting, right? Yeah, but it's just like, where it goes is a different calculus altogether. And some of the reasons we've turned down stories is like, maybe they didn't fit right. Maybe we couldn't find the right talkers, like before I was talking about these practical concerns of, who can tell us the story and do we have access? If the people involved, are they going to want to talk to us? Maybe they don't. Maybe they're just not talking to the press right now. So there's lots of just kind of practical things that make stories not work necessarily for us. Yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to say that we talk a lot to our international correspondents, and these are very, very busy people who are covering all areas of the world. They don't have time legitimately to be digging into something that then we say, well, it didn't quite work out, which is we've all, having done podcast stories, have all experienced that, where you put a ton of work into something and then for some reason it just never airs. So I felt that this question is really important, and knowing earlier whether or not it's going to work. And so I don't have like a good answer, but one thing that I remember saying to the very first story we ever did, first episode of the show, which is not that long ago, 3 years ago, which took place in Brazil. And I asked Lulu Garcia Navarro, who was at the time the outgoing Brazil correspondent, and I said, what's like the thing that over the last 3 years in Brazil that you've never really been able to do a story about? And she said, well, it's race. I mean, she actually said she's done but dozens and dozens and dozens of stories on race, but she just couldn't talk about it in some way that would make sense to American audiences. So we did the story Brazil in black and white, but I think what made that work was that it was hard to tell. It was confusing even for the reporter. And whereas sometimes if the story is too known or too expected, or you're just kind of telling it because it's reporting on the topic as opposed to investigating it, I feel like sometimes that's where it can be harder. It can break down a little bit.
And speaking of stories that don't work out, again, like a follow-up from Mike, do stories have an expiration date? I mean, obviously, all the 3 podcasts, you don't cover current affairs in the sense of like news is breaking and you cover it. And in your case, do a story or a narrative have as an expiration date, sorry. Yeah, you can start, Gregory. Yep.
I would just say, I constantly feel that my stories are about to expire. Like any idea I have, I feel like either like it's not going to be relevant anymore, or so I don't know. I constantly fear this. I'm then always assured that a story is a story. So I try to remind myself that that's true. We have done stories that hit a particular moment, sometimes unfortunately. I mean, the anti-caste story that I mentioned came just for some bizarre reason the day after this incredibly brutal attack in India, and so there was maybe felt more relevant or more timely because of that, not by any reason that we would have chosen, but I think we do aim to be evergreen, which gets back to the thing that Tracie and I were saying about setting a question, because if the question is the thing that can feel a little more timeless, maybe.
Tracie?
Yeah, I don't know if I have necessarily a story that that we have like a time limit on our stories. Like sometimes, once again, you do have something that is in the ether a little bit, and you want to capture the zeitgeist. We actually had to do some shuffling with our story plan because we had been working on the 1918 flu story. And speaking of things that you work on and then they don't see the light of day, like I was working on something that fell out of that episode. But anyway, so we had been working on that. Then we had the idea about me doing something about Nina Simone because like right at that same weekend was when the George Floyd protests were hitting, did I just mute myself? Sorry. We're hitting their like peak. And so, and we also felt like putting out the 1918 story that same weekend would have been a little tone deaf. And so we did like kind of push that, we did push out the Nina Simone story that week. But yeah, I feel like that's one of the benefits about working on the type of show that we're working on is that we're not really driven by the news cycle, but at the same time, we still have the option of responding to it and at least seeming like we're in conversation with it. That's been something that at Radiolab we've been struggling with a lot is what do people come to Radiolab for? Do they want an escape from the news or do they want us to go deeper on the news? And yeah, and so like at the beginning of quarantine, we were like, should we be putting out more escapist things or should we be putting out things, but we're also, we're rooted in a science. So we should be putting out stories about coronavirus. Like it was like a really kind of tricky moment to navigate. And I don't know, I think we came up with like a mishmash of of things responding to the news cycle and things not responding to the news cycle or whatever. Yeah.
Thank you. And Anna, have you started working on a story and then decided that, nah, this is not going to work out for our podcast or?
Oh, sure. I actually, to be honest, I'm sure we have. I struggle to find an example right now. Actually, we've been wanting to do a story about it's again about communist times, and it came from a rumor or sort of a myth that there was a protest, actually a gay march in the 60s in Sofia, which seems, and so far in our investigation, we cannot find any actual support for that statement. And we wanted, but nevertheless, we wanted to investigate the topic of how the regime was treating gay people, but we're really struggling, and as Tracie said, we're really struggling to find anyone who is willing to talk, even on audio, even when we say, tell us your story and we'll get an actor to recreate it. People just, we just haven't found our speakers yet. This is actually the second year I've been saying this in an interview. Last year at a similar forum, we were asked a similar question. I was like, yeah, and I hope next year we manage to find them. And please, people, if you know somebody. And yeah, it's still relevant. We're still trying to find them.
Yeah, I would love to listen to that episode, actually. Gay Pride March during communism. That's quite interesting. Well, I've been going back and forth myself to whether to ask you about the pandemic or not. Now that Tracie mentioned it, I think I'm gonna ask you a bit, and because again, I oscillated between wanting an escape and not hearing anything about the pandemic, and I'm sure many listeners probably did the same, and or like having a story about going back to 1918 with Radiolab or the Hotel Corona that Rough Translation did, that were actually quite interesting, and I didn't feel, I don't know, burdened by what's happening in the world now. So did the pandemic change the way or we tell or you tell stories, or like finding a fresh angle and like kind of avoiding this trap of having like a trite tale?
I would say the pandemic, as for everybody, changed like so much of what we do. I mean, I had certain trips planned that immediately were not taken, and so suddenly, if travel is not possible, that changes an international show for sure. But in another way, I think the thesis of our show has always been that that the in some sense we're all going through similar things, and I don't mean that in the kind of Disney World kind of way, but for instance, when people talk about I don't know, the presidency of Donald Trump as something singular in the U.S., there's many movements like Trump's movement, many figures like Trump in different parts of the world. So and you can look at like parallels like that in a lot of ways, and we've exploited that to understand things that are happening in the U.S. by taking a trip other places. The pandemic is like the ultimate example of that. We could literally go anywhere and understand how we're all dealing with the same virus and yet dealing with it in such different ways. And that teaches you so much about who we are. So I feel like we're not at this point doing pandemic related stories only because we kind of ourselves got tired of them, but for a while it is what allowed us to sort of up our output and become a more regular show as opposed to seasonal.
Yeah, I would say that for Radiolab, I think we've done a couple of stories that were very pandemic related. We, in our Dispatch series that we had out earlier this summer, and we've also done a lot of stories that were maybe in the hopper. We were working on them before the pandemic struck. And then they just sort of like took on new meaning in a post-pandemic world. A really good example of that is Octomom, our story about the octopus living under the ocean by herself, trying to keep her little baby octopi safe. That one from Annie McCune. And so like that didn't start as a pandemic related story. I mean, it is not about the pandemic, but it feels like the pandemic, when you listen to it. So we definitely have a lot of stories like that. My AIDS story was something that wasn't about the pandemic, but yeah, looking back at a public health crisis that the government didn't do a good job of responding to, feels like a pandemic, so there's definitely a lot of stories like that. And, at Radiolab, we kind of call those stories that like stories that are looking at the thing, but kind of in like almost looking at the thing, but it's not really about the thing. And so those are like a lot of the stories we've been doing as well. Those stories that are like kind of in that middle place of not being about it, but sort of are about it. But yeah. And that also kind of like fits with somebody's question earlier about relevancy, because sometimes things take on different relevances over time.
Exactly. And I just recalled a quote from Nina Simone in that episode that you did, where, what she said during that performance, it sounded like a warning to us today, and very relevant to what's happening at the moment. And actually, there is a question for you. Teodora Barzakova has always wondered how much of the conversation that you hear between the presenter and the producer who is telling the story on Radiolab are actually rehearsed and scripted?
So a lot of it is unscripted. So I think a lot of shows like invented this. Gregory can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a lot more radio shows do this now, called the brain dump. Which is when the reporter and the host go into the studio, and the reporter essentially about their story, and it can take an hour of just going back and forth, and then you do use that raw material, that brain dump tape, as your script. That doesn't mean that everything in the final product is completely unscripted. Like, a lot of it will be scripted, because sometimes you do have to write words, but a lot of it is unscripted. And so that's how you get that back and forth. And our host, Jad Abumrad, he tells the story about how he'd been working on a Radiolab piece with a reporter, and he found that whenever they track it, he was really bored by the story, wasn't that interested in it. But when they would take a break and walk around the block to get a coffee or something, and she'd be talking about it just casually to him, he was like all in, super, super excited about it. And so he basically brought that walk around the block getting a coffee energy into the studio. And so that's how that's kind of how we get that sort of that unscripted, unrehearsed sound. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about how that's why the reporter being excited about the story and being interested, and the reporter sort of being allowed to follow what they find exciting and interesting about a story, is important, because they have to do that brain dump and they have to like perform in it a little bit. And it falls flat if they're just like, if they're not really if they're very meh about it. Yeah.
Thank you. And I can keep asking you questions, but we're running out of time. So with one sentence, I just wanted to ask you, when it comes to storytelling and, let's say, budding podcasters, what's one piece of advice you could give them? But very briefly, with one sentence. Tracie, you go first.
Reporting is very important. It's the most important part of the whole thing.
Okay, thank you. Anna, it's your turn.
Most people actually want to talk and want to be asked questions. And also, I can add, a car sometimes make a great sound booth.
Thank you. And Gregory?
I would say, I used to tell people, don't live in New York. But that's not really relevant to certainly this crowd. But I suppose if you can put yourself in a place where things are happening, or you realize that things are happening in a way that are not part of the general conversation. I mean, you get yourself out of a media conversation and into the field, whatever the field means, and then tell us stories from the field is sort of like the essence of reporting.
Remember the before times when you can actually do
I have no idea what that means.
The
Zoom field.
Yeah, exactly.
Ay, ay.
Get
Well,
on the
hopefully.
phone. Get on
Go
the
ahead.
phone and get on Zoom and talk to everybody you can if you can't get in the field.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good pandemic advice as well. Well, thank you so much for being with us tonight. And just to our audience, don't forget to join us tomorrow when we actually have a session with Gregory, who will tell us how to tell stories from faraway places that hit close to home, followed by another very interesting panel discussion about the the rise of news podcasts. So consult your agenda on the conference website, and please join us again at the time, depending on the time zone in the country where you are. Gregory, Tracie, Anna, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to talking with you. And
Okay.
yeah, I can't wait to see you again, Gregory, tomorrow.
No, it was a huge pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Bye.